Quiet on the set.
Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We're very excited. This is our 30th episode, man.
3030.
Can you believe it? We hit 30.
Yes, we hit 30.
Are we done in Hollywood now? We hit 30?
I think we are. Oof, boy. Remember turning 30? That was traumatic for me. It really was. I was like, oh my God, it's all over.
Well, I hate to say it, but you know, being someone in Hollywood,
yes,
it's like Logan's Run. You're 30 and they track you down and kill you.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to be talking about someone that
barely lived past 30.
Barely lived past 30.
I know. Yeah, and I'm really happy to tell this story. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a story that I have been intrigued by for years and years and years. And it's about an actor that I so admire. I think he was one of the most gifted actors of his generation. I think he was a little ahead of his time as far as his acting style and what he brought to the table.
Yeah.
But it's about Robert Walker. He was probably one of the best actors at playing the sensitive boy next door, you know, the returning soldier coming home from war. Mm-hmm. He had such a sensitivity about him and such a quiet loveliness about him that really caught on with moviegoers.
Yeah, a vulnerability.
Yeah, he had it and just in spades. And he was so talented, but ended up having a pretty tragic life. And I find it funny that he ended his career playing one of the most complicated psychopaths in film history.
Yeah,
you know, he played Bruno Antony in Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece, Strangers on a Train in 1951. And to me, I find it interesting that starting out as the boy next door and then matriculating to this complicated psychopath, I think his role progression paralleled his life, going from innocence to complicated, tragic. You've seen it all.
Yes.
And I find that just fascinating about this guy.
Yeah. Well, and just going all the way back to the beginning, he really had kind of a tragic childhood, a tragic family life.
He did. You know, he was born in Salt Lake City. He had Mormon parents. They were very strict. They were very unloving, unaffectionate. You know, not a warm childhood. And I think he was the fourth, of
three boys,
and he was the fourth.
And I remember reading something that said if he had been born a girl, maybe they would have been excited.
Yes.
But his birth coincided with a famous fire in Salt Lake City, and his father was a city editor of the newspaper and was so focused, the whole family was so focused on this fire that in later years, I think Robert Walker even said, you know, from the very beginning, I felt unwanted and unloved, and it's just so tragic that...
Oh, I know, to start your life out that way. And I think being the fourth of a family that's not so affectionate, I think he was constantly trying to fill this black hole of emotional need.
Yes.
And I think that there's elements of that throughout his entire career and his entire personal life, which we'll get into all of that stuff.
Now, he did have an aunt who saw his early promise as an actor. Is that right?
Yes, he did. And, you know, it's funny because he was kind of a troubled child in the fact that he was rebellious. Mm-hmm. He acted up. He was terrible in school. He got into fights. He got into trouble. He got sent to military school, which was the advice of the aunt, who was his mother's sister named Hortense. They called her Aunt Tinny.
Aunt Tinny.
I love that. A little sidebar about Aunt Tinny. She was quite the character herself.
Really?
Yeah, she was really unconventional. She lived life as she pleased. She married and divorced this millionaire named Frank Odlum, and she became one of the leading female business executives in Manhattan. And from 1934 to 1938, she ran Bonwit Teller.
Oh my gosh, you're kidding.
Yes, which was, of course, one of the high-end department stores.
Yes, high-end.
So she was sort of a badass, you know, and she just lived life her own way.
Well, and she broke out of the Salt Lake City thing.
Yes.
So she saw the world in a different way, which really probably helped her encourage Robert.
I think without Aunt Tinny, he probably would have just dried up in Utah,
in Utah.
and never had any type of a career or life outside of his family.
That makes sense.
So Aunt Tinny is kind of a hero to him. She's the one that encouraged him to act. She's the one who got him accepted into the American Academy of Dramatic Arts.
Right, so she gave him the tuition.
Yeah, and she paid for it. So she really, really launched him on his way as far as a career. And, one other, I think, should be said, too, Aunt Tinny was the only one to actually encourage him to get therapy. And she arranged for him to be seen by one of the top psychiatrists at the University of Utah.
Wow.
However, and this shows what a good actor Robert Walker was, when Walker went to see the therapist, he put on a performance like nobody's business and convinced the therapist that there was absolutely nothing wrong with him.
Yes.
And so the therapist said, "You're fine. Go live your life."
Right. And he later, I think, is even quoted as saying that confidence was just a cover.
Yeah.
That badass that he had in school and displayed as an adult was really just a cover for someone who inside really needed some help.
Like some of the quotes I've read from him, he was acutely aware of what was going on with him.
Yeah.
But he couldn't help himself.
Right. So he is accepted into the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City, and there he meets a fellow student by the name, at the time, of Phyllis Eisley. They fall in love. She's taken with him and he with her, and this will prove to be probably the most pivotal moment of his life.
And I think this is the linchpin to every problem and emotional struggle he had was this relationship.
Right.
Phyllis was from a pretty well-to-do family in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her father owned theaters. He had some showbiz connections.
Okay.
So she comes into the game of acting a little more prepared than he did.
Savvy,
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
They fall in love and quickly marry.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I find it so interesting what people do.
Yeah.
Is when they were in school, he got very disillusioned with the whole academy program.
Okay.
And he very spontaneously one summer left school and he joined a banana boat. He went and worked on a banana boat because he thought he needed to experience life and feel things.
It reminds me of Long Day's Journey into Night. It's like the sun that goes off on the boat. Yeah.
Exactly. So he came back to New York after that summer. He told Phyllis, "I'm done with this acting academy. I want to get out there and live my life and be an actor." And surprisingly, she said, "Well, if you're not coming back to school, neither am I," which I think showed you how much in love they were at the time. And so they hit the ground in New York as actors trying to make their way.
Right. So they hit the ground running, but to no avail.
Yeah.
And Phyllis Eisley's father, who lives in Tulsa and has, as you mentioned earlier, has connections. He says, "Why don't you come back home, honey? Why don't you come back and I'll set you up at a radio station?"
Yeah, he basically dangled the carrot. He said, "I'll get you your own radio show, the Phyllis Eisley Show in Tulsa."
Which is...
if you'll come back.
Yeah, and she had a condition on coming back.
She did.
Which was her love.
Yes.
Robert Walker had to come too.
Yes. She made a deal with her dad. She goes, "Yes, I'll leave New York. I'll come back to Tulsa, but Robert has to come. He has to be my co-star, and you have to pay him exactly what you're paying me."
Right.
And I think that really shows how in love they were. And I think at that point, Mr. and Mrs. Eisley realized this is the real deal. She's not going to budge.
Right.
She loves Robert, so let's do it.
So at this point, they're still not married.
They're not married.
Right.
Well, it was interesting because when they all moved back to Tulsa, he had to get a boarding room at a boarding house because he was not allowed in the house.
No, you are not allowed
very
to sleep.
Improper.
Yeah, very improper. So they stay there for
a while. And what happened while they were doing the radio show, and I think this is really important, is I think Mr. and Mrs. Eisley, well, first of all, they really saw how genuine their love was.
Yes.
And they accepted him. Because at first they did not like him. They did not accept him. They finally accepted him into the fold. Mm-hmm. But also they recognized his talent. They were probably the first two people to say, this guy is insanely talented.
Right.
So, and I think that was good for Robert Walker, who didn't have the greatest self-esteem about his abilities and his career and all that stuff.
Right. Especially given the family life that we described earlier.
Yeah.
So they end up finally getting married.
Yes. Yeah, they finally got married. I think it was on January the 2nd, 1939.
Okay.
Which was the big year in Hollywood.
Yes,
1939.
of course. Woohoo.
Well, for a wedding present, her father gave them a Packard convertible. And, what a great gift. So they decided to take a road trip to Ogden, Utah to see his parents.
Okay.
And Mr. Eisley said, after you visit his parents, why don't you keep going to Hollywood? I've got some connections out there. Maybe we can get you guys seen by somebody who can help your careers. And they took him up on it.
So they head out to Hollywood in their new Packard.
Yes.
And they actually are interviewed, both of them, by Paramount.
Yeah, they both got screen tests.
And they were both rejected.
Wah, wah. Welcome to Hollywood, kids.
Welcome to Hollywood. It's always a little encouraging to find these wonderful, huge, talented stars that initially get rejected.
I know.
And they don't give up.
No.
They both went to Republic Pictures, which was, kind of a B studio.
Very, very B. I think Monogram was the only one below them at that point.
And he is rejected.
Yes.
But she gets a 6-month contract.
She does. And they put her to work immediately. I mean, they give her the lead in a movie called New Frontier, which starred a very unknown John Wayne at the time.
Wow.
And also, they gave her another project called Dick Tracy's G-Men, also for Republic. She's also the lead. Both films, she's still credited as Phyllis Eisley.
I was just going to say, right?
She hasn't emerged.
We haven't revealed what her real name is.
But meanwhile, Robert Walker lands some small roles in some MGM movies. He's in Winter Carnival with Ann Sheridan.
Okay.
And 2 Lana Turner movies. We love Lana on this podcast.
Yeah.
He's in These Glamour Girls and Dancing Co-Eds. Both of those movies, by the way, featured Ann Rutherford.
Oh, wow.
But they didn't really enjoy their time in Hollywood. She got out of her contract early, and they hightailed it back to New York. They missed Broadway. They missed theater. They missed, they thought that was going to be...
Yeah, that lifestyle.
Yeah, they thought that was going to be their careers, the theater.
Right, a better place for them.
Yeah.
When they go back to New York City, they quickly add to their fold a couple of sons, right?
They do. They have Robert Walker Jr. first, who we all know probably became an actor in his own right. Mm-hmm. A really very talented actor. It's eerie for me to watch Robert Walker Jr. in things because he looks so much like his dad.
Yeah.
And then they had Michael.
And Michael also dabbled in acting. He was in a lot of television shows. And he looks like his dad, too. Not as much as Robert Walker Jr.
So eerie.
Yeah.
Back in New York, Robert Walker actually hit first. He got jobs in radio and became very, very, very successful in radio and had his own radio show. He starts making money. He's supporting the family. Meanwhile, Phyllis is raising the kids, very unhappy about it because she was still
burning to be an
actress.
Yeah.
So she was finally able to get back to work, and one of the first auditions she get is for David O. Selznick, which it's all coming together.
Yep, and we're starting to piece together who this person is.
Yes. She auditions to play the role of Claudia in the filmed version of the very successful Broadway play, which starred Dorothy McGuire. So Selznick is quite taken with Phyllis, and he sort of becomes her Svengali. I mean, her mentor. And
remaking her, reimaging her, and renaming her.
And he renames her. And this is where the big reveal comes to play. He renames her Jennifer Jones. Of course, all know the beautiful, talented Jennifer Jones. And he really grooms her for stardom. I mean, he becomes obsessed with her. He is going to make this girl a star, much to Walker's chagrin.
Right. Well, and to start off with something as prominent as the Song of Bernadette, I mean, that is huge. She goes on to not only major stardom, but she also wins an Academy Award in 1943.
Yeah, but it was a rough road because once she got the Song of Bernadette, for publicity purposes, Selznick goes to Walker and Jones and says, you cannot mention that you're married. You cannot mention you have 2 children. That's not the image of our virginal Bernadette. So you have to lay low.
Yeah.
Which I think put another wedge. I think O. Selznick very calculatingly puts little wedges in between Robert Walker and Jennifer Jones because he was so obsessed with her.
He was so obsessed. Yeah. He not only does that, he also makes sure that Walker gets a contract at a different studio.
Yes.
He's at MGM now.
He wanted to make sure he was far away from his Jennifer.
Other side of town and just other projects. So they're not going to be working together.
Yeah, but it worked out well for Walker because, at MGM, his very first film he was in, he plays what he did so well, the sensitive soldier, boy next door type in Bataan, which came out in 1943.
Okay, and then he also goes on to do See Here, Private Hargrove, 1944.
Yeah, and before that, which I think is kind of important to say, is he got a very important part in an A-list movie, Madame Curie, with Greer Garson and Walter Pidgeon. And it's interesting because Garson and Pidgeon were very aloof to him on set, weren't very friendly, weren't very, kind to him, and neither was the director, Mervyn LeRoy. He had no time for him, which I think this further made him insecure about his work, which is a pattern I think that happens with him.
And consequently, his notices for Madame Curie were not great.
No,
People felt like he was miscast,
Yes.
and hearing that backstory,
He got no help.
it's no wonder he got no help, yeah. But back to the war genre, he's definitely getting a type. He's getting into these war movies that hopefully in a future episode we can highlight some of these.
Yeah, which I would love to do. But by the time all of this is happening, Jennifer is actually still filming The Song of Bernadette. It took so long to make this movie. And by then, she and Selznick have started an affair. It's the worst kept secret in Hollywood.
Yeah.
I think Walker senses it. There's trouble at home. It makes Walker drink more.
Yes.
He begins drinking heavily. His emotional state is just a mess. So finally, she finishes the movie. She wins the Oscar. She becomes a star. And so what does Selznick do next? As a follow-up for Jennifer, he casts her in Since You Went Away, 1945. But who does he cast as her love interest in the movie?
Robert Walker.
Yes. And it was almost like this controlling, sadistic maneuver where he makes them play lovers when they're going through this very complicated emotional breakup
And divorce, and everyone
it was like the Puppet Master.
knows.
Yes.
Exactly.
And everybody knew. Robert Walker tried to get out of it. He wanted to be recast. Selznick refused.
Yeah.
He even went so far as to personally oversee
the love scenes.
the love scenes between his
It's just gross.
girlfriend and her estranged husband.
And it wasn't
sadistic.
Yeah, it wasn't only uncomfortable for Robert Walker. I mean, Jennifer Jones, even though she was connected with Selznick, she was reportedly running off the set crying, and
she was a mess.
It was a mess, and they're doomed in the story.
Yes,
so it's
which
this
is
horrible parallel of being doomed in the story and they're doomed in real life.
And what an aptly named film, Since You Went Away.
Yes, oh my gosh.
He was a mess. I mean, he had a motorcycle accident during production. He had to shut down production. He was drinking so heavily. I mean, it was a disaster. They got through it.
They got through it. And in 1945, they do officially divorce.
They do. He really threw himself into his work after Since You Went Away wrapped. He was in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo with Spencer Tracy and Van Johnson, a great role for him. Johnson once said that he remembered Walker being sort of lost in his own world the whole time he was making the movie.
Well, it sort of references the type of acting style that was really a little bit ahead of its time that you mentioned earlier, and that whole internal work that a lot of actors weren't really doing, that he managed to make work so effectively.
Talk about sense memory.
Yeah, oh
Use
my
that
gosh.
pain.
Yeah. I think we're at a great juncture for this next part of Robert Walker's life. Before we dive into that, Steve, let's give the question for this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
All right. And of course, we're going to talk about Robert Walker in our quiz today. And the question is, which former First Lady did Robert Walker date?
I think I might know this one. All right. We'll come back with the answer and more about the wonderful actor Robert Walker after this.
Steve and Ann will be right back, but first, another stop on our Hollywood tour. Have you ever wondered if a single film has swept all 5 major Academy Awards? Those categories are Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Director, and Best Screenplay. Well, it's actually happened 3 times. The first was Frank Capra's It Happened One Night. That was in 1934, starring Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert. The second movie to do the same was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975. The only other film to achieve that honor was Silence of the Lambs in 1991. And now I want a glass of Chianti. And now back to Steve and Ann from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back, everybody. We wanted to give a shout out to our listener of the week, Jerry Malouf, who we got an email from, who was listening to our podcast in Japan.
How cool is that?
I know, technology.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. All right, we left off. Jennifer and Robert are divorced.
And Robert's a mess.
And Robert's a mess.
I mean, deep depression, emotional instability, hard drinking, and he gets cast in a movie. And it's a movie we've actually talked about. When we
Yes.
did our Valentine's movie episode, we mentioned this movie, and it's one of my favorites. It was The Clock with Judy Garland, 1945.
Right.
The thing about Judy and Walker, they were both in such a terrible place in their
Yeah.
lives that they really became close friends and sort of commiserated with their own personal demons and
Yeah.
their tragedies they were going through.
Yeah, and that perhaps is why that film is so successful in terms of the chemistry between the two of them.
Oh, incredible chemistry.
Yeah. He goes on to also do Her Highness and the Bellboy, 1945. I
That's
love
right.
that title. I haven't seen that film.
June Allison and Hedy Lamarr. It's a great movie.
Yeah. Till the Clouds Roll By, 1946.
Yeah, he played Jerome Kern.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
And one that's on my list, has been on my list for a while, One Touch of Venus in 1948. Now that's opposite one of our podcast faves.
Our patron saint.
Our patron saint, Ava. Her photo is right on the
Ava
wall in
Gardner.
our studio. Ava Gardner.
During the filming of One Touch of Venus, Ava and Robert Walker became very close. Some say it was an affair.
Okay.
Some say it was a very volatile, dramatic, short-lived affair.
Okay.
In her autobiography, Ava Gardner says it was not an affair. So do with that what you will.
Really?
But she did say something in her autobiography that I thought was really telling. She talks about an evening where they went out together and he drank too much, and she took him back to her place.
Okay.
He spent the night because there's no way he could get home.
Right.
And according to Ava's maid, the maid said, it was really pitiful listening to Mr. Walker weeping all night long, really sobbing and moaning. Jenny, where are you, Jenny? Why did you leave me? Why don't you come back, Jenny?
Oh, that is
Heartbreaking.
heartbreaking.
I mean, again, I think he was so heartbroken over his divorce from Jennifer Jones that it just
Yeah.
affected every element of his life.
Right. Well, and when you're still in love with someone else,
Rebound.
you really shouldn't marry again.
Rebound.
So in 1948, he marries a woman named Barbara Ford, who is the daughter of the famous director John Ford.
Yes. And John Ford was not too happy about it. In
Well,
fact,
he just wasn't a happy guy, was he?
he was, I'll tell you,
He was a tough guy.
Not someone I would want to mess with.
No, me neither.
But, he and his wife absolutely opposed the wedding. They refused to go to the wedding.
That's awful.
And they just did not give their blessing in any way.
Well, and that kind of worked because
Yeah.
the marriage only lasted about 5
It
months.
was 5 months, and I think very quickly Barbara Ford realized that he was still in love with Jennifer Jones, and that there's no way she could make a marriage with this guy.
Yeah.
And reportedly he beat her one time very, very badly.
Okay.
And this enraged John Ford, as you can imagine.
Of course.
And of course, who
Rightly
wants
so.
John Ford on their bad side?
Yeah.
And that may come into play later,
Yeah.
which we'll talk about.
So at this point, there's a person at MGM that sort of steps in and really helps Robert Walker out. And
Yes.
that is a Dory Sherry, who many people might know as the head of MGM after Louis B. Mayer. I think at this point he was the head of production.
Yes. Yes.
And he takes Walker under his wing and says, buddy,
Yeah.
you need help. I'm not going to rip up your contract, which I very well could.
Which he so could. He had every right to from the antics of Robert Walker.
And he would have been done.
Yeah.
He said, instead of that, it's up to you. You can either ruin your life or you can go to this clinic in Topeka, Kansas, the Menninger Clinic. It's a mental health sanatorium, and get the help that you need.
Yes.
And Walker decides to do that.
Yeah. And there's the quote from Robert Walker that I think is so telling too. He says, I went into the clinic a beaten guy, frightened and desperately unhappy, tortured by a sense of guilt and anger, doomed to the living death of an alcoholic. He was so acutely aware of it.
Well, and even in his time there, shortly after he's there, and in reading accounts of it, I'm not sure if it was kind of on purpose with the clinic, they let him out or he broke out.
Yeah, whichever version you want to believe.
And he got into some trouble. He
did.
Drank too much. He wrecked a police station. He goes back into the clinic.
Yes.
And this time it clicks.
Yes.
Something works. And the work that he's doing there, mental health work that he's doing, really does save his life.
Yeah, absolutely saved his life. And he was able to get out and resume his career, which
Yes.
is so rare. I mean, so rare.
Now, this tumultuous time in his life was, of course, covered by the press.
Well, oh, yeah, because he was always, in some kind of a drunken brawl, and his picture was in the newspaper, and it was embarrassing. Yes.
Yeah.
So as he resumed his career, he was fortunate enough to get cast in a Deborah Kerr film called Please Believe Me.
Yes.
It also helped that he had two of his very close friends on set with him, Peter Lawford and Marc Stevens, which actually we're going to talk about Marc Stevens in upcoming episodes that we don't know about yet.
Okay.
But, they were kind of there to keep an eye on him. But he did fine. It was also about this time, 1949, when he may or may not have married for a third time.
Okay, and I didn't find anything about it, but there are reports of that.
There's reports that he married this Hungarian actress named Hannah Hertelindi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct.
Okay.
Not much is known about their relationship, and this is very interesting. When I first wrote the blog article about Robert Walker, and I wrote about her, I had a very impassioned reader write to me and said that Walker and Hannah were never actually married, and he sent me copious documents of census reports of where Robert Walker was during this time. There was no listing of a wife. And she's not listed in any of his obituaries when he passed away. So whether they were married or not is a mystery. It's a question. So if anybody knows anything about that, please email us. We'd love to know what you got out there. And so he continues his career. He's in a comedy called The Skipper Surprises His Wife, 1950, with Joan Leslie, my buddy. And he's also in a Western called Vengeance Valley, a 1951 Western with Burt Lancaster and Joanne Drew.
Right.
And it's very interesting because Joanne Drew was one of Barbara Ford's best friends.
Okay.
So I want to know, what was that set like with Robert Walker, who reportedly beat up Barbara Ford and now starring opposite her best friend?
So they definitely had scenes together. I haven't seen that film.
What was that like?
Yeah, what was that like?
So many questions.
Yes. Well, after those films, there's a very pivotal film, which is what most people probably know Robert Walker from. Alfred Hitchcock, who had been following his psychiatric time at the clinic.
And almost obsessed with his time in the sanatorium and his mental health issues.
Right.
A little obsessed with it.
A little obsessed with it, and kind of handpicks him.
Yes.
In fact, Robert Walker is even quoted, I think, as being a bit surprised that Alfred Hitchcock wants him to play the lead in Strangers on a Train.
Yes, because he thought there's not an actor in Hollywood more perfect to understand the complicated, mentally disturbed, psychopathic character of Bruno Antony.
Yeah,
Nobody.
I think you call him a charming psychopath.
He was a charming psychopath.
And watching this film, and it's on many lists as a top, top 100 movies of all time. It's really one that if you have not seen it, you will be floored by his performance.
His performance is absolutely sublime.
And Farley Granger,
and
no
the
slouch.
fact that he wasn't Oscar nominated is still one of the great mysteries of the Oscars. But speaking of Farley Granger, in his autobiography, he tells a really heartbreaking story about when they first met.
Yes.
Before the production started on Strangers on a Train, they went out drinking.
Okay.
Which, Robert Walker and drinking, probably not a good mix.
Not a good mix.
They got drunk at a dinner, and then Farley Granger helped Robert Walker get back to his hotel.
Okay.
Robert Walker broke down, begged him not to leave him alone. He didn't want to be alone, begged Farley to stay. Farley Granger stayed with him in his hotel room, and the whole night he broke down crying about how heartbroken he was about the divorce from Jennifer. He's still not over her.
Oh, gosh.
It just affected him that deeply.
Yeah. And back to the Oscar nomination, which he should have received.
Oh, surely.
One report said that because he was on loan from another studio, they didn't want to advertise that. But how that would have helped him if he had received the recognition that he deserved. And I think, was surprised.
Yeah. Well, when you think about the great villains of Hollywood movies, he's always up there in the top 10.
It's an indelible performance. So we come to
the end.
A really tragic point in this story, because he's really on a high after this film. His follow-up film, which tragically ends up being his final film, is a Leo McCarey film entitled My Son John. And unfortunately, filming was completed, but there were some takes that they had to fill in from his work on Strangers on a Train.
Yes,
which is,
I know. They're just interesting they could do that. They did the same thing on Elephant Walk. When Vivien Leigh had to drop out of that, you can still see some of her scenes in there from the back instead of Elizabeth Taylor.
Oh,
so
wow.
I love how they could do that.
Wow. So he's just finished this film. It's August 1951, and his housekeeper, who also helped take care of his two sons, she makes apparently a frenzied phone call to Walker's psychiatrist.
Yes.
And she says that he's drunk. This is according to the psychiatrist.
Yes.
She says he's drunk and in a frenzied mental state.
Yes.
Okay, so his friend, Jim Hennigan, is at the house.
Yes.
The psychiatrist arrives, who I just have to say, if his name...
He's perfectly named, actually.
Does not tell you something.
Perfectly named.
His name is Dr. Frederick J. Hacker. I would not want to go to that doctor.
No, and well, we'll get into that.
Yeah. So he arrives at the house. He has been treating Walker. It's about 6 p.m. now. And Dr. Hacker says that he finds Walker in a highly emotional state.
Yes.
Okay. And according to Hacker, Walker says, "I feel terrible, Doc. Do something quick."
Yeah, according to Hacker.
According to Hacker. Now, Hacker also says he didn't know if Walker had been drinking.
Even though the housekeeper reportedly told him he had been drinking. Yeah.
So now, after 2 hours of this, of trying to calm him down, he calls another doctor, Dr. Sidney Silver.
Which I found that really interesting. If you're the one who's been treating Robert Walker all this time, why in the world would you bring in another doctor to help you with this?
Who doesn't know the case?
Who is this guy?
Right. And this is where things get a little creepy and a little weird.
Very, very weird.
Dr. Sidney Silver decides to administer a drug called sodium amytal, which is a barbiturate.
Yes.
Now,
and something you do not give a man who's been drinking.
Exactly. And reportedly he had received this drug in the past.
Yes.
But still.
And I'm sure he wasn't drinking when he received it.
Right, exactly. So by the report that I read, he was given 7.5 grain dose, which a grain, I had to do a little research on this. A grain is considered 65 milligrams. So multiply 65 milligrams by 7.5.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
I just want to add that as he was being administered this drug, Walker fought him hard. And actually, his friend Jim had to hold him down while Dr. Silver administered the drug.
Yeah.
Walker was a wildcat. He did not want the drug. He knew something was up. He was fighting like hell.
And I think even just before that, they were, trying to get him to take the drug. Jim, his friend, said he was sort of laughing about it.
Yeah.
He was sort of like, guys, I'm fine.
I'm okay,
I don't need this. I'm okay. And then it really got to be a struggle.
Yeah.
And they're holding him down and giving him a drug that he is not giving consent to.
Yeah, which just that alone is just horrifying.
So Robert Walker, ultimately, because of this drug being administered to him, he turns blue, he stops breathing, and he dies.
Yes, at 32.
At 32 years old. Now, his friend, Jim Hennigan, just to kind of give some perspective of Robert Walker's state of mind, this was his good friend. He said he wasn't remotely worried about him not having something on the horizon, that he had great faith in Dory Sherry. He also said that he had just seen a rough cut of the picture that we just talked about.
Yes.
He was happy with that. He had 2 young sons that he clearly loved and that he was involved with. He made a point of creating a relationship with them that he didn't have with his own parents.
To me, that's the most telling part right there. He had a lot to live for.
He did have a lot to live for.
Gwen Verdon, who was married to Jim Hennigan at the time, she went on record and she said that Hennigan told her that he felt that there was a deadly cover-up that night and that the doctors knowingly gave Walker this medicine that they knew would kill him. And it was a deadly mistake, or maybe something else. We don't know.
Right.
But also in the 1990s, there was a Dr. Alex Rogowski. I hope I'm saying his name is correctly. He was a colleague of Dr. Hacker's. And he told 2 crime writers, Stephen Farber and Marc Green, that Hacker killed Robert Walker. He actually killed him. But a doctor could get away with it back then. And, over the years, there's been much speculation about Walker's death. There's been rumors flying left and right that maybe David O. Selznick had something to do with it to get him out of the way because he was causing problems for Jennifer in the custody of the boys. Maybe it was John Ford, who obviously hated him for beating up his daughter. The truth is, we'll never really know what happened that night in Pacific Palisades to Robert Walker.
And there was no autopsy done. Which would have shown a lot.
And it's just a shame because he was such a gifted actor. He finally was getting his life back together, and then this is how it ends.
Yeah. One quote that I found from him that I just find so tragic. Someone asked him, what kind of person are you? And he said, I'm a mixture, I guess. And he went on to say, someday I'd like a farm in Connecticut. Like most normal folks, I thrive on a balanced diet, 2 parts quiet to 1 part excitement. And I think, that tragic ending really was so unexpected. I wish we could find out the truth.
I know. We'll never know, I suspect.
Yeah. But as we've often said, we at least have his work to
I know. And if you haven't seen his work, do yourself a favor. Go watch The Clock. Go watch Strangers on a Train. His body of work is amazing.
I think it's time for the answer to our Hollywood Pop Quiz.
Yes. And the question was, which former First Lady did Robert Walker briefly date?
Nancy Davis.
Yes, Nancy Davis, who of course became Nancy Reagan. They dated briefly after his divorce from Jennifer Jones. And Peter Lawford has some very colorful things to say about him in one biography. But I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Maybe a future episode we can share some of those
Let's
details.
just say that Nancy wasn't maybe quite the prude we all thought she was.
I love that. That's a great little button. That's a great little tease for a future episode.
We'll end up.
Yeah. We would love it if you would follow us on social media. Our handle is @FromBeneathTheHollywood We're on Instagram and Facebook, and you can watch the show on YouTube.
And also, please keep those emails coming. We love hearing from you guys. If you know what happened to Robert Walker, email us.
Yes, please.
info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com.
That's this week's View.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review. And tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor, Lindsay Schnebley. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. That's a wrap.